I still remember this day when I was in college. I was a sophomore. I was living in the mods, they called them, the modular apartments. That's where all the cool kids lived when they were sophomores. And the day was a unique day because I was the only one on campus. Everybody else had gone home for vacation or whatever, and I can't remember why, but I had to stay an extra day. So it was me and campus safety. That was it. And at first I thought, oh, that's going to be kind of cool. Like, I'll get the whole place to myself. And I woke up in the morning and I made breakfast and I went for a little walk. And then I just found myself just walking by my girlfriend's apartment for no reason because she wasn't there. That's Steph. I found myself walking by my friends' apartments for no particular reason because they weren't there. And then I thought, oh, I'll just see if anyone else is around. So I walked into the quad, and it was a ghost town. And by like the second hour, I started to get a little fidgety, a little just not comfortable in my skin. And then by the third hour, I didn't even believe in the rapture, but I was confident it had happened, and I was left behind. Like I was just so uncomfortable being alone. By the end of the day, I felt desperately lonely just for being alone for one day. Now, you can be lonely without being alone. And now I know with 2 toddlers, you can be alone and not be lonely. Because loneliness is not being alone. Loneliness is the gap between your desire for connection and community and your experience of it. That's what loneliness is. It's the gap between your desire for connection and community on the one hand and your experience of those things on the other hand. I was really moved by a story I read on a Substack that's run by Enyo Agata. She's a single woman in her 30s, and she has been watching her friends, one after the other, get married, start families, and slowly, not intentionally, but definitely stopping inviting her into their life, their household. And she describes the ache of loneliness that she experiences. She says there's nothing quite like realizing, usually when you're home alone and unwell, that you are nobody's priority. While everyone else is busy living their lives, you don't have someone consistently in your corner to help with the big and small things, like making you soup when you feel too ill to get up or stopping to pick up groceries so that you have one less task to do. I remind myself daily that this is a normal part of a changing season, that it'll eventually pass or at least soften. I'll be honest, most days it barely helps. The gap between our desire for connection and community and our experience of it is real. And it's not just something that affects single people in their 30s or 40s or 50s. It's something that affects married people sitting across the table from a spouse they wish they had more connection to, but they don't. That affects young people who have a cheap substitute for connection that they think is connection on their phone, and they don't know why they're lonely even though they're spending time with their friends all day. It affects older folks that just wish their kids would come back a little bit more often than they do or call once in a while. Loneliness affects all of us in different ways, and it affects a lot of us a lot of the time. But according to a study in 2024, 50% of American adults said that they feel lonely often. And 30%, almost a third of American adults said that they feel lonely at least weekly or have felt lonely at least weekly for the last year. Loneliness is an epidemic in this country, in this period of time. And actually, there was a paper written by Dr. Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General across several presidencies, on that exact topic, the epidemic of loneliness. Because it's not just pervasive in our society, it has very pernicious effects on our well-being, on our health, on our social life, on our society in general. And this is what Dr. Murthy wrote. He said, loneliness is associated with a greater risk of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. The mortality impact of being socially disconnected is similar to that caused by smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity and physical inactivity. And the harmful consequences of a society that lacks social connection can be felt in our schools, in our workplaces, in our civic organizations, where performance, productivity, and engagement are all diminished. Why are we so lonely? That's one of the questions we're going to talk about today. Why are we so lonely? How do we build a deeply rooted community? And how do we sustain a life in community? Those are the three questions we're going to be talking about today. So the first one is, why are we so lonely? And look, you can download all the podcasts and watch the YouTube videos about how iPhones are making us lonely, and how our built environment is making us lonely, and how social media is making us lonely. That may all be true, but that's not what I'm here to talk to you about today. You can get that somewhere else. My question is, spiritually speaking, why are we so lonely? What are the things that drive us to those things, that cause us to build things the way that we build them, so that we are disconnected from each other, to engage those things that we know aren't good for our social connections and community? Why are we so lonely? Well, the answer comes from the beginning of the Bible, not just the passage we read today. In Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis tells us, the Bible tells us, that we have been made in and for community. We have been made in community. Genesis 1, 26 through 28. Let us, God said, let us make humankind in our image. This radically monotheistic religion, this counterculturally monotheistic religion that the people of Israel held in a polytheistic world, talked about creation, and they said, God said, the one God, let us make humankind in our image. Later on, as Christians start to think about that in reflection upon Jesus' life and teachings, we start to realize, oh, that's actually a recognition of this doctrine we call the Trinity, that God is not just the great individual in the sky, that God is actually three in one, three persons, one God, perfect, eternal, loving, united community in unity for all eternity. And that God said, let us make humankind in our image, male and female. He created them. So he said, we want to make humans to be like us, like God, which is to say, communal by nature. And then he made a community. He didn't just make an individual. And even though Genesis 2 tells the story from a slightly different angle, it tells essentially the same story, which is God made Adam, the first man, and then immediately said, it is not good for this guy to be alone. And I know a lot of the women in here know some men that it's not good for them to be alone. God saw that way before you did. So he made us for community. Much like a redwood grove. You know, we have one of the great wonders of the world right here in the hills. Coastal redwood trees are the tallest living thing in the world. We don't get to experience the tallest ones because most of them were cut down long before we ever showed up on the planet. But I was up at Weekend Away. You might have heard of Tapestry Weekend Away. It's the best thing you'll do all year. You should sign up for it. It's August 7th through 9th. Little plug there right in the middle of the sermon. I was up at Weekend Away a couple of years ago, and this is one when we went to Alliance Redwood, and there's a zip line canopy tour, which basically means you zip line from tree to tree at the top of the redwoods. So I'm up there with a handful of you, 250 feet up in the air, and our guide grabs onto her harness, steps off the platform with one leg, puts her hand on a tree next to us, and shoves it away. And that tree went about 10 feet in that direction. And I don't know what everyone else was thinking on the platform, but I was freaking out because I know a little bit about physics. What goes out must come back. And we were only about 2 feet from the tree to begin with. So if it went about 10 feet in that direction, I was like, what did you just do? But the tree goes out, and then it starts to go like this. And then it goes like this. And then it goes like this. And it does this strange elliptical pattern, but that wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part was when the guide said, now look at all the trees around us. The trees that we're not touching that tree. And they all were doing this together with that tree. And she said that is something we don't fully understand, but we know that their roots are interconnected under the surface, and that somehow they're able to communicate the stress that the wind or elements put on each tree and share the load of that stress with each other. They were made to be in community. They were made for that, and they don't do well on their own. Part of the reason we're so lonely, friends, is that we have traded our created nature for something we like to call freedom, but is anything but. It's not freedom for thriving, it's freedom from constraints, freedom from commitments, from ties that bind us, from things that we have to go to because we said we would. We have traded rootedness in community for a false freedom that is really just being untethered from God and from each other. And a tree doesn't do very well when it's untethered from the soil, from other trees around it. Jonathan Haidt, who's a sociologist, who happens to be an atheist also, by the way, which is good context for this quote, he did an interview on The Daily Show not long ago, which is also not known for its deep love of faith and religion. But he says on The Daily Show, when we're not tied in, locked into community, we're free, but that doesn't make us happy. It's like if you try to raise a plant, not in the ground, but just up in the air. It can't be done. Religious kids, and so his area of research is anxiety and depression in young people. He says, religious kids are rooted in faith, traditions, rituals, community. They go to church every Sunday, or Jewish kids have Shabbat. They were always happier than secular kids on the scales. They always experience less anxiety and depression on the scales. But what happens after 2012, the advent of the smartphone, it's quite remarkable in all the graphs. He says the religious kids get a little more anxious and depressed. The secular kids get much more anxious and depressed. Why? Because the religious kids had thick community. They had a thick community of faith that was tying them to something real, someone real. Some of you are like, okay, I get it. I kind of maybe agree with you. But I'm not lonely because of something I did. I want community. I didn't pull myself away from the people that I wanted to be. They pulled away from me. They left me. And by the way, I don't want you to hear me saying that you and I are responsible for all of our relational disappointments and disruptions and loneliness. Not far from it, far from it. But we as a human collective, we as a society, we as people have in general decided we can pick and choose who we want to be rooted with. And we can pick and choose it for different parts of our life. So we make decisions about where we're going to live based on our career ambitions, not our community ambitions. We make decisions about the job we're going to have based on the salary it will make us, not based on the amount of space it will give us to be with our friends, to be with our families, to be with our parents as they age. We have untethered ourselves from community, and we've untethered ourselves from God. We've said, oh, God, we'll get back to you when we need you. We'll dig in when we've got time, or when it feels like important enough, or when we have kids, or when I'm really going through it. Then I'll dig in. But that's like trying to be a tree planted up in the air. So how do we build community? How do we build real rooted community? Well, let's look at the text. Let's look at Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. And we see that they do a handful of really remarkable things. Number one is that they share their life together. And when I say that they share their life together, I mean they share it in both formal and informal ways. So if you look at verse 46 says that every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They went to church. They went to worship together on a scheduled time where they would be there together. And they broke bread in their homes. Or another translation of that says they shared their food with one another. Formal and informal. They went to church and they hung out afterwards. And at a certain level, part of it is really that simple. You need both the structure of the formal time together and the organic way that relationships develop in the informal time together. You need to commit to the family reunion, but then you need to call your grandma once in a while. Right? You need to be in a connect group where you meet every week. And then you need to just text them and say, hey, I'm going to see this movie. Who wants to go with me? Hey, I'm going hiking. Who wants to go with me? Hey, I'm going on a vacation. Who wants to come with me? Formal and informal. They shared their life together. Redwoods, they share their life together. They really do. Those roots are amazing. They go through something called root grafting. Did you know this? Root grafting. The roots don't just tangle themselves up with each other. They actually, over time, fuse together so that your roots are now my roots too, and mine are now yours. It's so amazing how interconnected they are and how much strength that it provides them, because those trees, though I was up in one that was 250 feet tall. Our guide told us that was a short tree. We were kind of at the top of the forest, so that confused me. I was like, doesn't feel short, that's a long way down. And she's like, this tree was planted 100 years ago after loggers came through and decimated the old growth forest that was here. In 200 years, this tree will be 3 times the height that it is now. And the wild thing about that is that coastal redwoods, though they're the tallest tree in the world, have root mats that are only 6 to 12 feet deep. 6 to 12 feet. That's like Pastor Bernard, deep. That is not a lot. How can they not just get blown over in any strong wind? Well, it's because they are so thickly interconnected with one another that their roots don't go deep, but they go wide. They go wide, and you can't uproot a coastal redwood tree because its roots go so wide under the earth and are connected to all of the others, and they share the load. You got to share your faith for a deeply rooted. You got to share your life for a deeply rooted community, because the life above ground is sustained by the structure underneath. I'm going to say that again. The life above ground is sustained by the structure underneath. Real quick. I know that some of us, we want these organic relationships that just like happen, you know? And we think about times like, oh, and it just was easy, you know? Like it just flowed, you know? Like when I was in college, for example, for me, it's like, oh, I would just like see somebody in the hall and it just, oh man, yeah, let's hang out. And then we would just go hang out. But do you know what I had there? Structure that wasn't created by me. I had the structure with that person of living in the same space every day, all day. Walk in the same halls. We had the same structure of life. We had classes at the same time. We went to the same places to eat. We would say, oh, let's go eat. And there were like 2 options. The times in your life when you felt like those just organic relationships just happen, it's because somebody else built the structure for you. But when you come of age, when you leave those spaces where everybody just hangs out on their porch every Friday night, because that's just what we do, you have to create the structure. And the structure underneath is what supports the life above. Not only do we have to share our faith, we got to share our life. Not only do we have to share our life, we have to share our faith together. They dedicated themselves, it says in verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Now, the apostles' teaching and prayer, that sounds very much like faith. But the fellowship and the breaking of bread, weren't they just eating together? Well, in the early church, it's probably very likely the case that when they were together and eating, there was not a real distinction between eating a meal together and enjoying the meal together, communion. In fact, the way that this is written in verse 42 in Greek is different from the way it talks about breaking bread together in their homes in verse 46. It's the breaking of the bread. This sacramental act of communion. They shared their faith by listening to the apostles' teaching and learning from it. By the way, we have the deposit of the apostles' teaching right here. They dug into what God was teaching their minds. They fellowshiped together and built their bonds of faith. They prayed together and dug their hearts deep into God. And they received Jesus into their bodies in communion. They shared not just their life, but their faith together. And here's why that's important. Here's why that's important. About, 11 years ago, I had the privilege, and I put it this way intentionally, I had the privilege of watching my friend and mentor, as some of you have heard this story, David, die from pancreatic cancer. David, and the way that he lived, but also the way that he died, taught me so much about who God is and how to die. And that's a big part of the reason why I went through my cancer journey the way I did. I didn't have experience with cancer before I had cancer. I didn't know, I did. My mom had cancer when I was growing up, but I was a kid. I didn't know what it looked like to dig deep into my faith in Jesus in the face of death. But David did, and he showed me how to do that. And he brought resources up from that place that I wouldn't have had on my own. And so in the moments when I actually handled it in a way that I feel good about today, that was probably in part because of David. And watching the joy with which he handled that, and watching the love with which he handled that, and watching how he dug into and invested his heart in the resurrection of Jesus in a deeper way in that season. Redwoods, they do this other thing with their roots called hydraulic redistribution. You didn't know you were getting a science lesson today. Hydraulic redistribution is when roots, trees that have deeper roots or wider roots that have found reliable sources of water, actually pull that water in, but then deposit it in shallower, drier soil for those trees who are too young, whose roots are not deep enough to get to the water on their own in a drier season. In other words, those old trees that have deep roots can bring life to the young trees that can't access it yet. David was a tree with deep roots, and I wasn't. But I got to access the life that he accessed because I lived in community with him. See, that's why it's not good enough, frankly. I'm just going to be really honest with you. I'm really passionate about this. It's not good enough to say, you know what, actually, I get my best time with God by like going up into the hills and being in those coastal redwoods, and that's how I experience God. So I'm just going to go with my sermon podcast and my Bible, and I'm just going to spend my time with God. I don't need church. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. But yes, you do. Because there are things that you get from other people's faith that you do not have access to on your own. You do not. You need that spiritual hydraulic redistribution of somebody who has been in that suffering place and found God underneath the soil there and drawn him up and shown you what that can be like. You need someone who has gone through that intensely difficult season of parenting, that has found God in that place, and can draw him up for you and show you what that could be like. You need someone who has gone through years of not hearing from God. And they continued to pray. And eventually they heard that still small voice again. You need them for your own faith. That's part of how you build deeply rooted community. And the last thing that we see that they did together is not only shared their life, shared their faith, but they shared their resources with each other. They actually shared their resources with each other. Verse 44 says that all the believers were together and held everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. And if you read on in the book of Acts, you see in chapter 4, verse 34, it says that as a result of this, there was no needy person among them. Not one. Can you imagine? Like, that was automatic. When you came to church in these early days, you would not find a single person in need because people were so joyfully generous with one another. In fact, in that part of verse 46 where it says, they ate together with glad and sincere hearts, one of the translations of that could be that they shared their food with joyful generosity. Redwoods, they do that too. They do. They actually share their food. There's a mutant kind of redwood called an albino redwood that, because of a gene mutation, it cannot produce chlorophyll. That's what makes leaves green. That's what makes the needles on the redwood tree green. And because they cannot produce chlorophyll, they cannot do this thing called photosynthesis, which is what trees do to eat. It's the chemical process that they take sunlight and they transform it into their food, right? We all learned this in 7th grade biology at some point, right? So they cannot make their own food, but their roots are fused with the grove around them. And so guess what the other trees do? They send some of their own food through the roots. They send the carbohydrates they create through the roots to sustain this tree that was just born different. Didn't have the access to make its own nutrients that it needed. But it survives nonetheless. Redwoods do this for other trees too, that it's not about the way that they came about. It's not about their genes. It's about their circumstances. When the tree canopy gets devastated by fire, by insects, or by disease, the redwoods around it can actually sustain those root stumps for decades until they're able to regrow again and flourish. They share their resources because that's how they were made. See, what the early church is doing, friends, is they're not doing something that's like wild and evolutionary. They're tapping back into the way they were made. because they were made for community, real community that meant something. Where, yes, they said, we'll pray for you, but they also said, come over. Yes, we'll pray for you, but we'll also help you look for an apartment. Yes, we'll pray for you, but we also have a fund that will help you get into that apartment. And there was no needy person among them. It's an amazing community that we see here at the beginning of the life of the church. But let's be honest, it's a little bit of an idealized community. I mean, Acts chapter 2 is Acts chapter 2. In Acts 4, there's a similar sort of like summary of the beautiful life of the early church, and it was beautiful. But you read the rest of Acts? You read the rest of the New Testament? It didn't stay beautiful all the time. Because people are going to people. People will let you down. Relationships aren't always reciprocal. You want community and you want friendship, and you give and you give and you give and you give to this person in your life that's been needing you, but the second you pick up the phone to call them, they don't answer. That happens. You invite people into your life, and then you look back over a season of your life and you go, man, I don't remember the last time somebody invited me to do anything. That happens. How do you sustain a life in community? In a world where people. In a world where people pursue freedom from constraints instead of deep roots. That's the fear, right? That is the fear. And it's why we uproot ourselves from community to begin with. Because we're worried that we're going to be the only ones. We're worried that we are going to exhaust ourselves in community, and we're not going to receive nearly as much as we give. So better if I just try to do it by myself. Or if I pick and choose where to dip in so that I don't have to be responsible for other people, because they're going to wear me out. How do you sustain life in community? Well, the early church, they sustained this remarkable community, not because they were a bunch of remarkable people, but because they had met a remarkable person. Because they had met a remarkable Jesus. Because you see, they came to realize that the God of the universe, the one who said, let us make humankind in our image, that the second person of that unity, that community, that Godhead, that the second person became a human being and took on a body and committed himself to human beings forever. Threw his lot in with ours completely. It's like the soil became a redwood in our grove. And then that amazing person, he sent us his Spirit. He sent them his Spirit to be with them all the time, in formal and informal moments. He actually went deep into the life of the Father, deeper than anybody who has ever gone. He went deep into the divine life that sustains everything. And he said, I'm going to pull that up and I'm going to share this life with you. He shared the goodness that he experienced in the Father. He shared the resilience that the Father gave him in the face of suffering. He shared the deep love and belovedness and delight that the Father showed to him with us when we couldn't access it ourselves. And then he didn't just give us some of his resources to sustain our life while he took the bulk of it like a redwood tree normally does. He gave everything of his life so that we could flourish, so that we could grow, so that we could have real abundant life in God. That's what he did for us on the cross. Is he took all of his life, all of his resources, and he poured them into us on that tree so that we would have life and have it abundantly. So that's why Jesus says, you need to abide in me. Abide in the vine. That's why Jesus says, I am the bread of life. because you can't share a life that is depleting if you don't have it to give. But the thing is, friends, when you are fused to Jesus' roots, well, you realize that you're able to give way more than you'll ever receive from others, because you've already received way more than you could ever give. That is how you sustain life and community, is you root yourself in Jesus, because he will sustain you. He will give you the love, the trust, the faith to continue pouring in to others, rooting yourself with them, giving up some of your freedoms in order for the beauty of thick, beautiful community. I just pray that as we seek Jesus, we will find ourselves less and less lonely and more rooted in relationship.